I have been very blessed, really throughout much of my life, in being able to do that which interests me in the company of students and colleagues and readers and the world. And I consider winning the Holberg Prize one more kind of culminating piece of luck. I don't say that I don't merit it, but I don't in any real sense deserve it more than many hundreds of other scholars, humanists, theologians, jurists, and the like. So I just have to be humble and grateful for being here. Now, perhaps I will begin with Dagfinn's first illustration, which is to my right here, as an example of one way that I do philosophy, and which perhaps, in this instance, differs a little bit from Dagfinn. Dagfinn says, look at the duck-rabbit. Pretty bad duck-rabbit, by the way. Look at the duck-rabbit. And you will see that I come to it with anticipations. And if I see it as a duck, I have various anticipations. Or if I see it as a rabbit, I have various anticipations. And he seemed, perhaps I am wrong, to be suggesting that I anticipated that it is going to go on being rabbit-like, which is the last thing in the world I anticipate. I don't expect this to go eating carrots and this to go on eating carrots or anything. My anticipation is that it's a badly drawn chalk picture on the board which will behave like other chalk pictures, and it doesn't actually make much difference whether I see it as a duck or a rabbit, that I have those anticipations. Why I say this is one way I do philosophy is to take something literally and ask, is that what I want to say? Is that what people say? Is that what one should say? A very simple point. Now, I have failed in that book called The Social Construction of What. I take a leaf from the British novelist Graham Greene, who distinguished his novels into two classes, one which he called entertainments, and the other which he took to be serious novels. He didn't mean that his entertainments weren't serious. He didn't mean that there weren't a lot of implicit moral messages in his entertainments. It was just a different genre. And I regard The Social Construction of What as an entertainment, perhaps more as an ephemeral, something I think of as ephemeral, as addressing a question much discussed and which I thought, as a usually very private intellectual, I had a public obligation to discuss, because there were so many hot tempers, so many ill-thought-out remarks, and there was clearly a moment in mostly American academic and cultural history in the 1990s when it was a pressing issue and to which one might make a contribution. I also regard my little book, Why Does Language Matter to Philosophy, also ending in a question mark, as an entertainment in that it addressed a particular question about the way in which philosophy was being done by analytic philosophers at a particular time. In both cases, I notice, in retrospect, I tried to say that there were some rather enduring issues in a set of practices and current debates, and a lot of ephemera. In the sentence from the beginning of my inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, which Dagfinn read out, there's a strong implication that I hope that talk about social construction will go away. So I gave that lecture when, in 2000, I hoped that by 2009 I'd never hear the phrase again. And here I walk into this room and sit for an hour and a half or something. I don't want to hear the word ever again. Notice that although it is perfectly correct to say of the book about multiple personality, Rewriting the Soul, that it is an account of multiple personality as a social construction. You can say that if you want, if that helps. But I never used the phrase social construction in that book. And part of the point of the social construction of what is that it's always better to say something which is more specific. Often what is meant by social is historical. That is, which is of course social. If it's human history, it's social. But that one should think of, I wanted to tell about the historical circumstances under which a particular diagnosis became powerful and influenced a great many people's lives, and for a short time became part of public discourse. And I wanted also to suggest many of the evils which were associated with that, and so in a quiet way to make a contribution to public debate. But not thinking it useful to use the bland cover word, paper over word for difficulties, social construction. It seems to me that the question addressed to Dagfinn, why social? Well, the point of the question which was asked was, but isn't the social there before the constructing gets going? I mean, it all begins socially. And I think that that's important, an important question. And indeed, it is one of the most famous of contributors, one of the people whom I most admire in science studies is Bruno Latour, who wrote a wonderful, co-authored, a wonderful book called Laboratory Life, which in the first edition was called The Social Construction of Scientific Fact, and in the second edition he deleted the word social because he said he wasn't doing any work there. Of course the phenomena he was describing were social, and I would say were actually, in short time, were historical. They were about a particular group of laboratories at a particular time and what happened in the development of certain kinds of assays, and that's a very interesting historical process which led to what I call the laboratification of a particular concept. That's something which had been simply observed was replaced by various kinds of laboratory tests which solidified a particular concept, made possible the literal construction, that is the chemical synthesis of various compounds, and using that synthesis in order to replace the traditional methods of chemical analysis, for which work the Charles got a Nobel Prize, quite rightly. Thus, the social drops out for Latour, and indeed for me, construction should drop out except when there's literally a process of building up from parts, constructing. And if you can show that in a particular case, that's important to do. But often there's a better words in which to do it. So I think the social construction of what, my little entertainment of the late 1990s, has failed. Let me just conclude with one remark prompted by Dagfinn, and which was suggested by his opening remarks about Gestalt psychology. Nobody reads Wolfgang Kohler's 1929 book called Gestalt Psychology anymore. There's a vague idea that there is indeed a lot of discussions of shapes, Gestalten, and how we don't see by sense data, say, but why we see Gestalten, wholes, shapes and forms. In the middle of the book, and this is an observation I owe to a recent student of mine, Jeanette Denishak, there's a fascinating discussion of how human beings see at once what fellows human beings want, hope for, intend, etc. What put Jeanette Denishak onto this was that Wittgenstein, in what is traditionally called Part 2 of the Philosophical Investigations, from time to time refers to Kohler's Gestalt psychology, and she wanted to know exactly what is he referring to. And it's quite remarkable. Many of the most impressive passages in Part 2 are literally aphoristic paraphrases in order of paragraphs or sentences of Kohler. And what they're both extremely interested in is that I see that a person is happy, that I notice that Merle is startled, and I immediately know where something is startling her, and I look more carefully and I see it's a snake in the grass or whatever it is. This is Kohler's example. Or what actually starts, again I owe this to Denischek, with an experiment of the behaviorist Watson, but which Kohler turns into an example that I see a child, he turns it from a rat, Watson's rat, into a dog. I see a child not quite touching the dog. And I see that the child both wants to touch the dog and is extremely nervous and scared of the dog. I see this there. I don't infer that. I don't see the motion of the hand and say, oh, well, it's a little uncertain. And then I go on, what is it uncertain about, and so on. I just see it. And I see what's startling her, or see where she's being startled, see the location of what is startling her. And this is a type, and this is, I think, an essential attribute of human beings. And it is brought out by the recent discussions of autism, because what is characteristic of severely autistic people is that they don't have enormous difficulty in understanding what other people are doing, understanding emotions, the way I look at a person and see that they're kind of bored with what I'm saying and so forth. Autistic people don't do that. Indeed, they have to take lessons in how to tell when your co-conversationalist is getting bored. And there's even little devices which are manufactured at MIT, little extra eyeglasses which look at Rasmus up there, and I can see, and it goes sort of buzz in my ear and say, hey, stop talking about this, he's bored. So they don't have something that we have. And that is an important part of humanity. There are interesting theories circulating at the moment, originating in Italy, that there are neurons in the head which are called mirror neurons, and which have the property that when I see somebody who's angry, that bit of my head which is active when I am angry also becomes activated. It mirrors what the other person is like. I'm not at all sure about those ideas, but they are a remarkable detailed conjecture about, and Kohler wanted, he has a paragraph in which he says I'm only drawing attention to things which are noticed by everybody, a phrase mimicked by Wittgenstein, aphorized by Wittgenstein. And I hope that in due course we will return to these questions and will have some sort of theoretical explanation. He would certainly have been interested in mirror neurons. Here is, and this, if you want to talk about construction, but what a bad way to do it, is a neurological investigation of how it is possible for human beings instantly, unreflectively, uninferentially, to know what other people, very often, what other people are thinking, which isn't to say we don't also have to infer what other people are thinking from time to time, or what they want, or what they're afraid of, or what they're startled by, or whatever. So that it seems to me, a type of investigation which is deeply important. I don't want in any way to comment on whether Husserl would have been interested in that type of account, the interaction of the phenomenal and the cognitive. I presume that he would have, but it seems to me that is the right way in which to proceed rather than by an elaboration of Husserl's phenomenology. It's very important to have that elaboration to which Dagfinn has devoted so much of his life, but it's not what I want to do at all. I would much more try to think about what I call Kohler's phenomenon. And Vygotsky, these old guys are often very interesting. Vygotsky's idea that my descriptions of the social world my descriptions of my own emotions are not something that I project onto other people, but something that I internalize from my awareness of social interactions. So that my calling myself angry is something that isn't projected onto, oh gosh, that person's feeling like me, but rather I gradually learn the concepts of anger which are first deployed in the public sphere and then are gradually internalized. So these are all enormously important aspects of what, if you want to call it, is construction of the external world or sort of social world or something or the other, but I never want to use those words in so doing. Now, I realize I've spent too much time reflecting on Dagfinn relative to my other two speakers. Perhaps I would just say two things about Brune at the moment. I like the idea of risk governance very much. It's clearly a deeper concept than risk analysis and the like. There was one thing at which I thought she got me wrong for her own purposes. That is, she had on the board, I write of the taming of chance, that is, of the way in which apparently chance or irregular events have been brought under the control of natural or social law. And she said, she emphasized the apparently. I just meant unemphasized apparently. There are things that seem to be irregular, and for which it turns out there are probabilistic laws which to some extent describe the irregular behavior in a law-like way. And so I really meant just apparently, not apparently, but not really chance. On the contrary, they're really irregular, except that it turns out that we can find some underlying structure to that regularity. Now, she quite rightly draws attention to the enormous problems of being misled by quantification. There is a theory which very well elaborated in the book by Theodore Porter called trust in numbers, that part of the point of quantification, and it's an essential feature of democratization, that we need to have the feel that we are making objective decisions collectively. Here we do have something social, committees, government committees and so on, public action committees, all the lot, have to get together and to formulate policies, make decisions and the like. And in a democracy, an authority doesn't impose from above. We have to create the authority, and one of the roles of the quantification is to create something which all of us will agree on, or at least if we disagree on the numbers, will then produce other numbers and sort of have a playing field which is a little bit away from ourselves. And so that the trust in numbers is a function of democratic procedure. And I believe that's a very important observation. I don't quite know what kind of observation it is. And there is, of course, a danger in that of taking the numbers too seriously or believing that there must always be numbers. I was at a talk of a very distinguished professor at one of the most distinguished universities in the world who was talking about things which I would have thought fell under a precautionary principle, and he said, oh, that precautionary principle, that rubbish. You know, it's all done in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And I said, but that's exactly the point of the precautionary principle. It's for situations where we don't know what the probabilities are, and we have no grounds for the probabilities, and we aren't very clear of what the possibilities are, and hence we're not very clear about what the potential utilities are. This is that kind of person. And then he just scoffed at me. So I said, scoff. I mean, you don't know what you're talking about, man. Whereas I think that Brune does know what she's talking about. And I completely agree with her that we need that the talk about a precautionary principle, I'm a little more generous than in the quotation from Rio, because I think there are other people who are other states. Those Rio conventions really are people, they're trying to find some agreement between themselves. knowing that the Americans will never pay any attention to a precautionary principle at all. That's the only bit of the intellectually advanced part of the world, if I don't know what to call it, not just industrial. I mean, in Europe, the precautionary principle is a part of European law in various ways. It's adopted in many parts of the world, in Australia, to some extent in Canada, but it has no legal standing whatsoever in the United States. You might even say partly because the United States is the model of all democracies, the hyper-democracy, where you have to get numbers or else the whole society will fall apart. Anyway, I believe that the problems which Bruna Dimarchi addresses because she's so aware of catastrophes, apparently even starting with thinking about her own village. I kept on thinking about Ignazio Siloni here. For people who know Ignazio Siloni's history will, the great Italian and controversial novelist. Finally, me as a public intellectual, I've got 20 minutes so I can stop. Look, first of all, I don't have, and in fact, I find I don't aspire to that oomph. I have only once in my life done sound bites, and that was after a conference in Canada on obesity and the way in which obesity discourse had taken over so much of health science. I was asked to do a few minutes on Radio-Canada, the French network, and I decided that I would just do a soundbite, and the soundbite was, being overweight is not bad for you, or at least being overweight does not kill you. I said that about 6 times. The point was that and I did try to make the point, but most people would have missed the point. Overweight was defined in 1998 by the World Health Organization and many national health organizations as a body mass index between 25 and 30. Now, actually, the body mass index became really quantified in Norway. Right after the Second World War, there was a massive epidemiological survey directed at finding potential problem areas for tuberculosis. And it was thought that the cheapest quick indicator of a danger zone would be where people were underweight. And the best way you could get an objective measure of underweight was that particular index, it's one of many which are possible, which is now called the body mass index. That is, they were looking for underweight people, not for overweight people. And then it finally, 50 years later, in 1998, we got this decree that overweight was bad for you. And it's very curious. It does increase risk factors for death. It just doesn't increase the risk of death. It's a big little puzzle there for some people to think of. It's a serious puzzle to think about, a statistical puzzle about the nature of risk. I mean, it's something that Bruno might want to have some comments about. Well, anyway, that's the only time, and it just doesn't. And in fact, the word which was used in the Norwegian survey was that body mass index has a bathtub curve. That is to say, as soon as you get to about 30, mortality goes whoop. And as soon as you get below about 17 or so, mortality goes up too. Not quite as whoopy as with obese, but it's bad for you. So that was the only time I've done a soundbite. So let me conclude with the remark about the dark me. And there's too much irony in my work. There really is. This is perhaps because of some kinds of insecurity of my own. And people often ask, okay, so you've given us all the options and given bad things and good things about all of them, but what the heck do you think? Now, in a way, the Mad Traveler's book was a partial answer to that with respect to multiple personality. The subtitle of it is something like Reflections on the Reality of Transient Mental Illnesses, trying to discuss where a transient mental illness is a mental illness which is culture-bound in some way, comes into being at a certain point in time in a certain place, does not occur elsewhere much at that time, and goes away at later times in the same place. So it's not that it's transient in the patient, but it's transient in the community. And there are a lot. Anorexia is probably a transient disturbance of the mind. and body. Certainly multiple personality was hysteria in the old days, was various kinds of, I believe that various kinds of illnesses attributed to women today are what a sort of choice from a symptom pool, and I gave an account. I gave my own type of answer, which is not a simple answer, to what is a necessary and sufficient condition for something to come into being as a transient mental illness. So I did try to answer that. But in general, it is a defect in the way in which I proceed that I am often very ironical. Now, partly this is because I think things are just awfully complicated. In middle life, I could have become very rich when I wrote that multiple personality book, because there were a lot of litigation about false memories and their effects, and whether people really had been sexually abused as children or not. And I had all this stuff about it, and legal firm after legal firm would phone me up and say, we got this hot case coming on and we need an expert witness. And we've been reading you and we think that something you say here we could really use. So we'd just love to give you $10,000 an hour to stand up in court and say just exactly what you said in these 3 sentences here. And I would say, look, man, I can't say that because the next paragraph says something different. It says it's more complicated. Oh, yeah. Well, nice talking to you. I mean, that's who I am. But it does also come out with a lot of insecure irony, and I regard that as a defect. Just a final word on the notion of a public intellectual. Michel Foucault made some remarks which I think are very prescient. I mean, he was thinking of the role of his immediate generation preceding him, the great intellectuals of which Jean-Paul Sartre is undoubtedly the most memorable, who had opinions on everything. Didn't matter whether they often contradicted their previous opinions, but they were very highly outspoken, brilliantly literate, truly amazing people. And Foucault said the era of those people has finished. And it's not just because, you know, the oomph has gone out of the average French academic or something. It's because the intellectual has a different role now. And he obviously thought of himself as having that role. That is, that in his investigations of madness, of criminality, of all the things which he did in his early and middle life, he was trying to discover the elements of the things which our society takes as inevitable and which aren't inevitable, in order to give us a better grasp of who we are as social beings. And I would like to think that in a much more modest way, I mean, Foucault was a great man, just like Sartre. In a much more modest way, my small endeavors have tried to participate in that sort of thing, and I would be perfectly happy to take that, Foucault's account of the role of the intellectual, as something that I have in small ways aspired to. Thank you very, very much.